Let's do this. Randy the Rat. Just as I am about to leave the cramped toilet of the Boeing 747 soaring above the Atlantic, I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the tiny mirror above an even smaller sink. I pause and study the determined woman staring back at me. Gone is the carefree 32-year-old from just 3 weeks ago. In her place stands a woman on a mission, and that mission is revenge. I've always considered February a dreary month. With Christmas and the New Year celebrations behind us, great clouds huddle over my hometown of Lincoln, keeping any blue sky at bay. In short, it's as cold and miserable as I feel. And as if that wasn't enough, Valentine's Day, the supposed most romantic day of the year, falls smack in the middle of this dismal month, which only adds insult to injury when you've just ended things with an on-again, off-again boyfriend. But while working behind the reception desk at the Hatfield Hotel, voted the friendliest hotel in Lincoln for 2012-2013, my day took a definite turn for the better. Standing before me was perhaps the most attractive man I've ever laid eyes on. I'd heard all about love at first sight, and while I wasn't convinced it was love, I certainly felt a strong attraction. If nothing else, a burst of pure lust. He was absolutely gorgeous. Hi, I stammered, my cheeks blushing redder than a traffic light. Can I help you? Hi, I believe I have a reservation for 2 nights under the name Randolph Hindle. Oh my, he was American, and his voice sounded like the guy who announces Hollywood blockbuster movies. My legs suddenly had the consistency of my mum's trifle. I chided myself silently. Control yourself, Kate. Stay professional. Of course, Mr. Hindle, I managed to reply, though I couldn't help noticing my voice sounded unnaturally high. Surely he must think I'm off my rocker. Please, my friends call me Randy. Really? Randy? Doesn't this American know that Randy in the UK isn't a name at all, but a cheeky reference to feeling sexy? A few shaky minutes later, and I had Mr. Hindle, as I insisted on calling him, all booked in. It's room 223 on the second floor. Do you need any assistance with your luggage? I asked, handing him the key card. No, I'm good, thanks, he replied, pausing to cast a downward glance towards my chest. For a heart-stopping moment, I wondered if he was checking out my cleavage. Then he said, Kate, and I realized he was merely glancing at my name badge, not my boobs. With a smile bright enough to light up the gloomiest day, he strode off towards the lift, or as he might say, the elevator. Just a few minutes later, as I was recovering from what could only be described as a schoolgirl crush, he reappeared. I'm really sorry to bother you, Kate, he said. Now, it might seem pathetic, but I can't tell you how chuffed I was that he remembered my name. I can't seem to find my room. Did you say it's on the second floor? He asked, returning the key card. I quickly checked and replied, Yes, room 223. It's definitely on the second floor. I turned to my colleague Rose, who'd just clocked in and was taking off her coat, and said, Rose, can you keep an eye on the desk while I help Mr. Hindle find his room? A bewildered Rose nodded, probably wondering why I hadn't just asked the bellhop to escort him. Stepping out from behind the reception desk, I said, Please follow me, secretly thanking my lucky stars that today I was wearing my new killer heels, even though they pinched a little. We crossed the lobby and reached the lift, just as its doors opened. I stepped aside to let a few pensioners, likely on their way to visit the famous Lincoln Cathedral, exit. After you, Kate, he said, as I entered and pressed the button for the second floor. Moments later, as we stepped out, he turned to me with a confused expression on his handsome face. But you said this was the second floor. This is the third. No, this is the second floor. The reception is the ground floor, then comes first, and this is the second, I explained. Ah, now I get it. In America, we call the ground floor the first floor. That's where I got mixed up. With that resolved, I watched him exit the lift. Just before the doors closed, he turned back and said, "I'm here for a boring property deal. I don't suppose you'd be interested in showing a lonely American around your beautiful city tonight in return for dinner." My mind screamed, "Ah!" Yet thankfully, I heard myself actually say, "That would be lovely. I finish at 6. And that was how it all started. It turned out that Randolph, I could never bring myself to call him Randy, was from California and a very successful realtor, which is what Americans call an estate agent. And speaking of property, we got on like a house on fire. Within a week, we became inseparable. He even postponed his return to the States, and I found myself falling head over heels. He confided that he'd married in college, or as he clarified, what we would call university in the UK, another quirk of American versus British English. His marriage hadn't lasted, and he'd been divorced for over 10 years. The fact that he was now single was music to my ears, and when just a fortnight later he asked for my hand in marriage, that music became a symphony. So, were all my friends and family made up for me? Were they heck? Mum, what are you thinking? You hardly know him. Sister, I've had a bottle of milk in the fridge longer than you've been dating. Best friend Scarlett, he's fit, but you should definitely wait a little longer. Although I knew they had my best interests at heart, I had cloth ears. I was getting married, and that was that. The last day of March found me and the aforementioned, together with 20 other of my nearest and dearest, outside Lincoln Registry Office. For a change, the weather had been kind, which I took as a good omen. Despite their misgivings, everyone was done up in their finest. Mum had even dug out a fascinator that she had last worn when her and Dad went to the horse races. I had a lovely bouquet of lilies that had cost an arm and a leg, but looked fabulous, and a smile that was literally making my face ache. There was just one thing missing. Randolph. The appointed time came and went, so I tried calling his mobile, or cell as he called it, but there was no answer. Don't Americans know that the bride is the one who's supposed to be late? Dad grumbled. Maybe he's had an accident, Scarlett suggested, as my watch showed that he was now 20 minutes overdue. Don't say that, love, Mum said. I'm sure he'll be here in a mo. But he wasn't there in a mo. In fact, he never arrived at all. After an hour of waiting, and with the registrar insisting we reschedule, we eventually headed back to Mum's. It was painfully clear I'd been jilted. A few days and countless packets of tissues later, I was sitting at home when I received a strange phone call. "Can I speak with Kate Logan, please?" "This is the florist." What could they want? The last thing I needed was another reminder of the worst day of my life. "This is Kate." "Hi. There's been a problem with the payment for your wedding bouquet. It hasn't gone through." Reaching for my tablet, I replied, "I'm so sorry. I'll check my online bank and see what's happened." The banking app only took a second to open, and after a quick glance I said, "I'll have to call you back," and quickly hung up. I stared open-mouthed. My current account had a zero balance, and yet I knew that I had been paid just last week. My blood ran cold. This must be a glitch. With a trembling finger, I selected my savings account, where I had put all of the money my granddad had left me when he died last year. Empty. Every last penny gone. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the local police station talking to Detective Roberts. His first question: who had access to your bank account? I was mortified to tell him about my whirlwind romance to an American who I knew so little about, and yet with whom I had shared my password. It had seemed so innocent. He told me that he used his mother's maiden name for all of his logons, and asked me, innocently, or so I thought, what I used for mine. As it was the name of my first cat, it seemed like a funny story to share, and yet it had cost me dearly. The next day, the detective called with more unsettling news. Apparently, Randolph Hindle was a false name. No one by that name had entered or left the UK in the past 12 months. With no further leads, the police said that there was nothing more they could do. I hung up and realised I had two options: accept that I'd been duped and try to move on with my life, or get even. Truthfully, it wasn't much of a choice. It was time to channel every trashy TV detective show I'd ever watched. I grabbed a pad and pen and began jotting down everything I knew about Randy the Rat. After meticulously reviewing every conversation we'd ever had, as well as all the photos I had of him on my phone, I knew that he was clearly well versed in property matters. Plus, I recalled that while watching an old western starring famous movie star Clint Eastwood, he casually mentioned he'd gone to school with Eastwood's son. A quick Google search confirmed that Clint Eastwood not only lived in a town called Carmel, California, but had even served as its mayor. I gazed at the nearly blank sheet of paper, barely anything to go on, yet it was a start. I immediately made two phone calls. The first was to my manager at the Hatfield Hotel, who was only too happy to give me a 3-week leave of absence starting immediately. And the next was to the travel agents to book a flight to the west coast of America. The hunt was on. My plane finally touched down at the sprawling LAX airport, and after a little confusion with a surly border control agent who insisted my date of birth was wrong, he claimed I was born on the 7th of June instead of the 6th of July. His supervisor clarified that in the United States, dates are written with the month first, while everywhere else, the day comes first. No apologies were offered, but I was just glad to collect my suitcase and be on my way. My body clock was shot. With an 8-hour time difference between the UK and the US, even though it was only 6 o'clock, my body insisted it was 2 in the morning, and that I desperately needed to get my head down. The following day, precisely at 6:30, I woke to the early sun streaming through the window of my modest motel room. I lay there remembering my last visit to America, a long weekend in New York, the Big Apple, with my best friend Scarlett, filled with all the typical tourist activities. But this time there would be no sightseeing. After a quick shower, I dressed and stepped outside. Despite the sun's presence, there was a definite chill in the air. For a moment I considered heading back to grab a hoodie, but I knew I'd rue that by mid-morning, as the temperatures were due to soar. Besides, I was just a couple of minutes away from a Denny's across the motel car park, a fast food restaurant I remembered from New York, where the coffee was half decent. And I needed to make sure I had a good meal to sustain me through what was bound to be a busy day. While waiting for my order, I switched on my tablet to find the cheapest way to get to Carmel. Quick as a wink, Google told me it was by Greyhound bus, and within a minute I had my ticket booked. The bus was set to leave in about an hour. With a full tummy and more coffee in me than I typically consume in a week back home, I returned to my motel room, packed my suitcase, and dropped off my key with the receptionist, who was a lot friendlier than I usually am at that time in the morning when I man the desk at the Hatfield back in Lincoln. With not a little trepidation, I set off to the bus station where I boarded the bus. Gazing out of the window, I marveled at place names I recognized from countless American TV shows. At one stop, an older woman boarded, and we struck up a conversation which helped pass the time. After about an hour, she reached into her bag and asked, "Would you like some chips?" Frowning, I replied, "Actually, I would love some, but surely they must be cold." She looked like I was crazy. "Of course they're cold, honey. You can't get warm chips." Then, with a flourish, she pulled out a packet of crisps. Once again, the subtle differences between American and British English left me bemused. Eventually, the bus slowed to its final stop as the driver announced, "End of the line, Carmel by the Sea." I gathered my belongings. I had booked the cheapest hotel in Carmel, though by Lincoln standards it cost a fortune per night. However, I saved money by not needing a taxi. This town was tiny by American standards. Just a few minutes later, I was checked in and tucked into bed as my body lost the fight to stay awake. Damn this jet lag. The next morning, I was wide awake and ready to plan my next move, but like yesterday, my stomach reminded me that breakfast was a priority. As it was only a small town, I decided to put on my backpack and wander around until I found somewhere to eat. But this town was way too posh to have anything like a Denny's. After half an hour with both my feet and my stomach complaining, I finally spotted a small diner called Joe's, which looked like it had been repurposed from an old railway carriage. Unusually, there wasn't a greeter inside the door, so I decided to simply find myself a place to sit. But as I walked past a table, a man stuck up his hand and said, "Excuse me, can I have a refill?" "If you'd like," I replied with a smile, realizing he'd mistaken me for a waitress. "And?" he prodded. "Well, I think you should speak to someone who actually works here," I teased. Instantly, he realized his mistake and apologized profusely. "I'm so sorry. Please let me make it up to you. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? Or, judging by your accent, perhaps a cup of tea?" Taking a seat across from him, I grinned and said, "I'll take the coffee, but only because clearly Americans can't make a decent cuppa." That coffee led to breakfast, during which I learned his name was Guy, a 35-year-old local who had lived in Carmel all his life. I guess you must be asked this by every visitor, but do you know Clint Eastwood? I asked. "Everyone in Carmel does," he replied with a grin. "He used to be the mayor and owns a local bar." As much as I was enjoying his company, I remembered the reason I was here at all. What about his son? He looked puzzled. Most people just want to know about Clint, but as it happens, I do know his son, Scott. He was in the year above me in school. With my heart pounding, I retrieved my tablet from my backpack, and after bringing up the clearest picture I had of Randolph, I turned it towards my new friend. "Do you know who this is?" "Sure. If you've finished eating, I can show you." Confused, I tucked my tablet away, and after Guy had settled the bill, he led me outside. "It's just a short walk along the sidewalk," he said. I was so intrigued by where he was taking me, I never even corrected him that of course he meant pavement. A few moments later we stopped beside a bench and I looked around in a state of confusion. Grinning like a Cheshire cat, my new friend pointed down at the bench, and on the backrest was an advert with the words, "Let Larry take the worry out of buying your new home." and next to that, a picture of Randy the Rat. That's Larry Peterson, Guy explained. He sells houses around here. His office is on the other side of town. So he even lied about his name, I exclaimed. After this stunning new development, I explained my mission to Guy, and he kindly offered me the use of the office at the back of his shop. My first call was to the Lincoln Police Station, where I luckily caught Detective Roberts just as he was about to leave for the day. After briefing him on everything I'd uncovered, he promised to contact his counterpart in the Carmel Police Department. My second call was to Mum to reassure her that I was fine and that things were finally coming together. An hour later, I had given my statement to the local police, who, I must admit, I was shocked to see were armed. I'd seen guns in the movies, of course, but this was the first time seeing one in real life. And that brings us right up to today. Larry Peterson, who I knew as Randy the Rat, has been arrested and is awaiting his court appearance. All of my missing money has been returned, but most surprising of all is that I've resigned from my job at the friendliest hotel in Lincoln, 2012 to 2013, and now I'm waiting for my American work visa to be approved, as my fiancé, Guy, has offered me a job helping out in his shop. Let's do this. A kind of magic. I was what can only be described as a sulky teenager, with few interests and fewer friends. So when Mum told me I had to waste my precious weekend going to my older sister's wedding, it's fair to say I was not best pleased. Little did I know that this wedding was not only going to change my sister's life, it was going to change mine as well. Despite not being a wealthy family, my parents decided to push the boat out when their only daughter decided to tie the knot. Which meant that after being bored to tears at the ceremony, we all arrived for the reception in what Dad called a marquee, but looked like a giant circus tent to me. I was just starting on my third helping of trifle when a woman I'd never set eyes on before leaned over and said, "Hi, I'm Faye. Can I borrow this?" And without waiting for a reply, plucked the spoon right out of my hand. "I haven't finished," I complained, but I was met with a chorus of shushing from everyone else at the table. Faye then picked up a napkin and wrapped it around my spoon, and with the whole table engrossed, watching her every move, tossed it up in the air. But while the napkin fluttered back to the table, the spoon had vanished. "Amazing," said Mum. "Where did it go?" gasped my Auntie Marge. But this mysterious lady just smiled and moved on to the next table. "Worth every penny, isn't she?" said Dad. I finally found my voice. "But who is she?" I asked. "She's a magician your dad hired to entertain the guests," Mum replied, adding, "I thought it was money down the drain, but I have to hold my hands up. She is impressive." And Mum was right. She was. I watched mesmerized as she flitted from table to table, sometimes picking things up and making them disappear, and other times having people choose a card from a pack she brought out of thin air with a flourish. Needing to see more, I got up and started to follow her around the tables, her tricks getting more and more elaborate, until finally she arrived at my sister, the new bride, and her husband, my new brother-in-law's table. She approached the happy couple and after congratulating them, asked if she could see their wedding rings, and they obliged by holding out their hands towards her. Taking both of their hands in hers, She shook them vigorously 3 times. And when she let go, both of the wedding rings had gone from their fingers. "Look in your pocket," Faye said to the best man. And when he did, he reached in, saying, "I don't believe this," pulling out the missing rings. That was her final trick, and before I knew what was happening, this incredible woman had left to a rousing round of applause. I traipsed back to my table, and as I sat down, Dad said, "I think someone has a little crush," and he wasn't wrong. Oh, I didn't have a crush on Faye. She was old enough to be my mum. But I was smitten with the whole idea of magic. The following week, it was my 15th birthday. And while I knew that my parents were buying me a new bike, I pestered them for an extra present, a magic set. I even volunteered to clean the windows if I could have one. On the morning of my birthday, I woke up and rushed downstairs. And sure enough, there in the hallway was my brand new bright red bike. "Do you like it?" asked Mum. "Is it the one you wanted?" Looking all around, I mumbled, "Yes, it's brilliant, thanks, Mum. But did you get the magic set I asked for as well?" Crestfallen, she sighed, "Yes, it's in the kitchen." Without another word, I shot into the kitchen, and there it was, a huge yellow and blue box with the words, "The Bumper Box of Magic," written on the top. Dad was sat eating a round of toast, looked up from his newspaper. "Do you like your bike, son? It's a beauty, isn't it?" But I wasn't really listening. I was totally focused on the box of tricks that lay in front of me. It's not an exaggeration to say that from that point on, the art of magic became my life. I stopped playing computer games. I didn't hang around with the few friends that I did have. No, I was much too busy learning how to deceive people with sleight of hand. A year later, it was Careers Day in school. People from all sorts of businesses, both local and national, arrived to give us advice on what to do when we left school. There were even soldiers in uniform from the armed forces. They had each been given a table in the assembly hall, which they had used to display pamphlets and other bits and bobs relating to their respective industries. I wandered over to a table that had been draped in a bright blue cloth and had a model of a cruise ship sitting on it. "Are you interested in working in the travel industry when you leave school?" the man dressed in a white suit asked me. "No," I said, shaking my head to emphasize the point. "I'm going to be a magician." And with that, I picked up a small plastic palm tree that was part of the table display and pretended to throw it in the air. Of course, when the man's eyes followed what my right hand was doing, I slipped it into my pocket. "That was astonishing," he said, reaching into his own pocket and pulling out a business card. "Here, take this, and when you decide to leave school, give me a ring and I will get you a job entertaining our cruise ship passengers." And to cut a long story short, that's exactly what I did 3 years later. I will never forget the first day I walked up the gangway of the SS Princess of the Waves, which was docked in Portsmouth. I was dragging my suitcase full of clothes with one hand and a large trunk full of magic props I needed for my act with the other. All the members of staff were very friendly, but they were clearly split into 2 different groups. One was the crew, who were responsible for the running of the ship, and the other were responsible for making sure the passengers were well taken care of, and I was part of this team. The ship set sail that night for a fortnight's cruise around the Mediterranean Sea. And I was excited to learn that every time the ship pulled into a port, I was officially off duty, so I could go ashore and explore all of these exotic places. However, tonight was my first ever performance, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. I changed into my stage costume, a sharp black suit that had lots of hidden pockets, and made my way to the main theatre. "You fit?" Cindy, the entertainment director, asked. "It's a full house tonight." "I'm not sure I can go on," I said, holding out my hand to show that it was shaking. "Nonsense. You've just got cold feet. You'll be right as rain as soon as you start." And she was right. My first few tricks were pretty simple, and I soon got into the swing of it, basking in the crowd's gasps of amazement. But as my routine was reaching its climax, things suddenly went pear-shaped. My last trick was my most elaborate and involved asking a member of the audience to step into the Chamber of Disaster. Truth be told, this was just a wooden box painted black with some stick-on glow-in-the-dark stars stuck on the side. Not surprisingly, I chose the prettiest woman in the crowd and encouraged the crowd to give her a round of applause for volunteering. I helped her onto the stage and opened the door of the box for her to step inside. Turning to face the crowd, I boomed, "Now watch as the young lady disappears." And quickly I spun the box around. You could hear a pin drop as I opened the door, and sure enough, my volunteer had vanished. However, before I received the expected applause, a young boy who was sat at one of the front tables shouted, "That box has a false compartment. She's still inside." As he was correct, I decided to beat a hasty retreat and said, "That's all for tonight, folks. Thanks for being a great audience. Good night," and signaled for the curtain to be brought down. Cindy was waiting backstage. "It was all going swimmingly until that last trick. Don't let it get you down," she said encouragingly. The next day we were in the port of Lisbon, Portugal, and so I had the day off and went exploring. But no matter how beautiful the city was, my mind was fixed on tonight's performance. It had to go smoothly. At 9 o'clock sharp, I once more took to the stage, and the first few minutes went well. I felt like I had the crowd in the palm of my hand. Then disaster struck. I invited a middle-aged man onto the stage and asked to see his wristwatch. Once he had given it to me, I pretended to throw it in the air, and of course, it disappeared. The man was laughing, the audience were applauding, and then the same boy shouted, "He put it in his trouser pocket." Sheepishly, I slipped it out and gave it back. For the second night, the act was ruined. I didn't go ashore the next day, but rather I stayed in my cabin practicing. Tonight had to be perfect. Once more I stepped onto the stage, and although I tried not to look, I couldn't help noticing that the little boy, my tormentor, was sitting in his usual place at the front. Halfway through my act, I produced a deck of cards and asked the captain, who had come to watch the show, to choose one. I gave the deck a quick shuffle and then got a sharp knife and stabbed it into the cards. "What was your card?" I shouted to the captain. But before he could answer, the boy shouted, "It's the 6 of spades. It's not a real deck. They're all the 6 of spades." The crowd started to boo, and shamefaced I left the stage. Cindy was waiting and unable to meet my eyes. She said, "The captain would like to see you in his cabin." This was pretty grim. I knocked on his door and he said, "Enter." But as I did, the ship shuddered, and both the captain and I were thrown to the floor. As we lay there, I could hear a loud commotion outside and the sound of a klaxon. "Get to the lifeboats," the captain said, pulling himself to his feet. "We're sinking." Quickly, I made my way to the boat deck and was impressed with how efficiently the crew were filling the lifeboats with the passengers and lowering them to safety. I jumped in the nearest boat and sat down next to a couple who held the small boy who had been giving me grief during my shows. He was fast asleep. Within minutes, we were fully loaded with passengers, and we were gently lowered over the side and into the Mediterranean. An hour later, the SS Princess of the Waves had completely sunk, and all that was left was a handful of lifeboats waiting for rescue. I noticed the little boy was starting to rouse. He opened his eyes, yawned, and stared out at the empty sea. In a small voice, he turned and looked at me and said, "Okay, I give in. What did you do with the ship?" "Let's do this." The first time I saw her, she was striding across Clapham Common, hair dancing in the wind. She moved with confidence, like she owned the world and didn't care who knew it. I was on my way home from a mate's place, hands shoved deep in my pockets, with my collar up to ward off the chill. As we got closer, I caught her eye and we smiled at each other, like we'd known each other forever. "Bit nippy for a stroll, isn't it?" she said, her voice almost lost in the stiff breeze. I shrugged self-consciously. "I guess so, but they say exercise is good for you, keeps the blood pumping." She laughed, a warm sound that seemed to cut through the frosty air. "I'm Angie," she said, holding out a gloved hand. "Glenn," I replied, shaking it, half expecting her to pull away and disappear into the night, but she didn't. Instead, we walked together, like it was the most natural thing in the world, the common stretching out before us. We talked about everything and nothing. She told me about growing up in Clapham, about her dad who worked in a bank, and her mum who made the best roast dinners. I told her about my dead-end jobs and my dreams I wasn't quite brave enough to chase. By the time we'd reached the end of the common, I felt like I'd known her all my life. I was smitten. "Fancy a drink?" I asked, half joking, half hoping. She tilted her head, considering me. "All right then," she said, and those two words changed my life forever. Just 2 months later, we moved in together. All we could afford was a basement flat that smelt faintly of mildew, no matter how many air fresheners we hung up. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Angie brought a kind of energy to the place, filling it with laughter and little touches that made it feel like home. A colourful blanket on the worn second-hand sofa, an old lamp we'd found in a skip on the rickety table. We spent our evenings curled up on the sofa in front of the telly, her head on my shoulder. The living room was small, with the wallpaper peeling off its walls, but it didn't matter. We had each other, and that felt like enough. Some nights we'd talk for hours, pondering our future. "One day," Angie would say, her eyes sparkling, "we'll have a little house, a garden for the kids to play in, and a dog." I'd nod along, imagining the life she painted so vividly, a life that seemed so out of reach. Still, we might not have had much, but what we had felt real. We were a solid team, or so I thought. When my dad's mate Stanley offered me a job at the local DIY store warehouse, it felt like a step in the right direction. It wasn't glamorous, just shifting boxes and doing odd jobs. But it was steady work. My first day was a Monday, and I threw myself into the grind. 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. By the time I got home, my body ached, but seeing Angie's smile made it all worthwhile. "Brought you these," I said one evening, handing her a bunch of daffodils I'd picked whilst walking home through the park. Her face lit up. You would have thought I'd given her a diamond ring. My reward was a kiss on the cheek, and that was enough. "You're a good one, Glenn," she said, arranging the flowers in a vase. Our life settled into a rhythm. Work, home, sleep. We started to talk less about dreams and more about the practicalities of making ends meet. But all that changed when she told me she'd seen a doctor and there was a baby on the way. "We'll manage," I told her, trying to sound confident. "I'll work harder, save up." And I did. Through the biting cold of winter, when my breath hung in the air like smoke, I put away every spare tenner I earned. When our old telly broke, we couldn't afford to replace it, so we spent our evenings huddled by the fire, talking about baby names and our hopes for the future. I still remember placing my hand on her stomach, feeling the little kicks from inside, and marvelling at the new life we'd created. It was a freezing January morning when Angie nudged me awake. "It's time," she whispered, her voice tight with pain as a contraction hit. I scrambled to get dressed, my hands fumbling with buttons, trying not to panic. We made it to the hospital in the nick of time. 30 minutes later, our daughter was born. She was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and a cry that filled the room. Angie held her close, and I held Angie. We all had tears streaming down our faces. "She's perfect," Angie whispered. I couldn't disagree. She looked just like her mother, and that was perfect to me. Those early days were a blur of sleepless nights and endless nappy changes, but they were also filled with moments of pure joy. Our little girl, Sandy we named her, was the centre of our world. She took her first steps in the cramped living room, her laughter echoing off the walls. Life was hard, but we had each other, and for a while that was enough. I don't know when it started to fall apart. Maybe it was the long hours at work, or the exhaustion that seemed to seep into every corner of our lives. Maybe it was Angie, or maybe it was me. What's the point in placing the blame? The first time I came home smelling of beer, Angie didn't say much. She just looked at me, disappointment flickering in her eyes. But it wasn't just one time. The pubs became an escape, a place to forget the pressures of work and family. Angie tried to talk to me, to pull me back. "You're not the man I fell in love with," she said one night, her voice trembling. But I didn't listen. Couldn't. I was too far gone, caught in the headlights of my own despair. One day I came home to an empty flat. Her clothes were gone, Sandy's toys missing from their usual spots. There was a note on the table, a few short lines that tore me apart. "I can't do this anymore. Sandy deserves better. Goodbye." I sank into the chair, the weight of her words crushing me. She was gone, and it was my fault. Now I sit here in this dingy kitchen, the walls closing in around me. The happy memories are long gone, replaced by unpaid bills and empty bottles. Sandy's photo is propped up on the shelf, her smile a painful reminder of what I've lost. I think about writing to her, about begging for forgiveness, but I don't. Begging's not my style, and I know she's moved on. I heard through the grapevine that she's with a soldier now, hopefully someone who can give her the life I never could. Still, there's a part of me that hopes that one day I'll see Angie and hold Sandy again, hear her laugh, and tell them both how sorry I am. Until then, I'm here, stuck in this kitchen. I guess I'm up the junction. Let's do this. Totally worth it. 5 miles from home, and the traffic ground to a halt. I glanced through the windscreen at a sky greyer than my old school jumper, and prodded at the buttons on the radio in the hope of finding some music that would help me pass the time. Unfortunately, I tuned into a modern boy band, caterwauling, and soon my wife slapped my hand away before I could try a different channel. I love these, she cooed. Leave it on. I slumped back in my seat while she enthusiastically sang along at the top of her voice. There are many things I love about my wife, but her singing abilities are not one of them. I needed to distract her. "What do you think of the new neighbours?" I asked, while surreptitiously turning down the radio. "I've only said a quick hello as they were moving in, but they look nice enough." "Is it just the two of them?" I continued, putting the car into gear as the road in front of us started to clear. "No, they have a little girl as well," she replied. "It will take some getting used to after Mrs. McCormack." We'd only lived in our semi-detached house for 3 years, and in all that time the adjoining house had been occupied by a lovely old lady with the rather impressive name of Philomena McCormack. It's no exaggeration to say that Mrs. McCormack was just about the perfect neighbour, always quick to smile and say hello if we happened to cross paths, but in the main keeping to herself, which suited us just fine. However, a couple of months ago we came home to find a for sale sign planted in her garden. Apparently she'd taken a tumble, and her son had decided that she could no longer live on her own, and took her to live with him and his wife at the other end of the country. Not a week later, and the sign was removed by the estate agent. We were getting new neighbours. The final few miles of our journey were tortuously slow, but eventually we reached home, and speak of the devil, our new neighbours were unloading boxes from their car. "Hi, welcome to Orchard Avenue," Sue shouted, waving like a demented seagull. "I'm Sue, and this is Jim, my husband." "Hi, we'll have a proper catch-up when we finish moving the rest of our stuff in," said the man, who I guessed was about my age. "Where are your manners?" his wife barked at him, and then, turning to us with a beaming smile, "I'm Josie, and this miserable bugger is my other half, Carl." "Do you need a lift with anything?" I offered, more out of politeness than anything else. "No thanks. The removers brought all the big stuff. This is just the breakables, like this," said Carl, holding up a violin which he produced from the boot of his car. Sue, who used to play the violin in the school orchestra years ago, asked, "Do you play?" only to be met with shaking heads. "No, it's our daughter Maisie's. She's just learning." Eager to let them get on, I said, "Okay then, I'm sure we'll bump into each other soon." "Bye," we all said in unison, and with that, stepped into our house. The next day was a Sunday, and the sun put in an unseasonable appearance, so we decided to fetch out the sun loungers from the shed and spend the day vegging in the garden. But no sooner had we sat down than the sound of a cat being strangled cut through the air. "What the bloody hell is that?" Sue said, putting down her paperback. We both stared in the direction from which this awful sound was coming. Next door. "Go and have a peek," Sue whispered, although she might as well have shouted because no one could hear anything with that screeching noise. I duly crept up to the fence and put my eye to a gap between two of the slats, and there in the middle of next door's lawn was a little girl enthusiastically playing, if that's the right word, the violin. What we didn't know was that was just the start. For the next month, the hideous sound continued to emanate from our neighbours. In the morning before the child went to school, as soon as she arrived back home, and what seemed like all weekend. We did try to reason with Josie and Carl, asking if perhaps Maisie could limit her practice to just an hour or so in the evening. But what we thought was a reasonable suggestion fell on deaf ears, The screeching went on and on. One Saturday morning, when once more we couldn't watch TV or invite friends around because of the budding violinist next door, Sue turned to me and simply shook her head. I knew this was the calm before the storm. We could ask them again, I started, but she cut me off. Don't, Jim, don't. We've asked until we're blue in the face. You have to do something. Her shoulders slumped. I'm at my wit's end. It ends tonight, I said, and I meant it. Truth be known, I had a plan I'd been working on up my sleeve. Oh, it wasn't complicated or even wise, but I was confident it would work. I mean, how could it fail? Since they'd moved in, they'd gone out every Saturday evening to do their shopping at the local superstore on the outskirts of town. They left at about 7ish, and they usually didn't return until roughly an hour later. That was plenty of time for me to put my plan into action. Sure enough, just before 7, I watched from behind the curtains as they pulled off their drive and drove down the avenue, allowing them a few minutes in case they'd forgotten anything. I went into our dining room and from a shelf recovered a key. Mrs. McCormick's son had asked if we'd keep a spare key to his mother's house for emergencies, but we had never had occasion to use it. To be honest, I'd almost forgotten that we had it. Key in hand, I slipped out of our front door and across onto next door's path. With a quick look round, I unlocked the door. With my heart beating in my chest, I crept up the stairs, and through an open bedroom door, I saw the offending instrument resting on a stand. I didn't hesitate, all the anger I felt making my blood boil. I reached out and picked it up by the neck. How could something so small and light be capable of making such a terrible impact on our lives? With no time to lose, I descended the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, and swung open the door, only to come face to face with the biggest policeman I have ever seen. Do you live here? He demanded, squinting his eyes. No, next door, I stammered. Well, it's been reported that someone is sneaking about. Why are you in here? And what's that in your hand? He said, noticing the violin. My response might surprise you, because it surprised both me and the copper. Sorry, I shouted, and putting my head down, butted him in the stomach. Winded, he fell into a flower bed, and I took my chance to sprint away down the path and onto the avenue. Within minutes I had reached the local park, and without hesitating, climbed to the top of the children's slide. From here I could see flashing blue lights, as more police cars, presumably summoned by the bobby I had attacked via his radio, raced up to the park gates. It's easy to say in hindsight what would have been the best course of action. Obviously, I should have walked calmly up to the police officers running towards me, apologised, and handed over the stolen violin. Did I do that? Did I buggery? A red mist descended. As the coppers all converged on the slide, I stood at the top and raised the violin above my head, and with a shout of, "It's over!" threw it with all my might to the ground, where it smashed to smithereens. Suddenly my head cleared, and I calmly sat down on the slide and glided down and into custody. 3 weeks later, at Newbury Court, I was stood in the dock. Mr. James Fletcher, you have pleaded guilty, which is to your credit, to the following charges: burglary with intent to steal, criminal damage to a violin, assault on a police officer, and resisting arrest. These are serious offences, and as a result, you will serve 6 months imprisonment. Is there anything you'd like to say? I turned and glanced at Sue, who was teary-eyed in the gallery. Then I looked back and said, "Judge, it was totally worth it." This video has been specially chosen to improve your English, so give it a click and I'll see you next time.